Welcome to the Greater Culture Podcast, where we have conversations about how to elevate the quality of life through movement, nutrition, recovery, and mindset practices. Welcome back to another episode of the Greater Culture Podcast. Your host, Brad Marshall. Today, very excited to be joined by Amishi Jha. She is a professor and researcher at the University of Miami, focusing on mindfulness, and also the author of Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Mind. So Amishi, thanks so much for taking some time to spend with me on the podcast today.
So excited to be here with you.
So you're someone who has been spending her life focusing and studying mindfulness, which seems to be a growing, trend in our current population. I always love hearing people's stories on how they found themselves into the roles that they're currently in. So tell us a little bit about how you found yourself as a professor and researcher and how you stumbled upon the field of mindfulness as your course of study.
Yeah. It definitely was not anything I'd ever planned. And it's so funny to hear you say the field of mindfulness, because when I started this work, there was no field. I mean, mindfulness was like such a crazy thing to be studying. So it is kind of an interesting journey. So just a little bit about me. I'm a neuroscientist, and in my lab, we study primarily the brain's attention system, and also affiliated with that, something called working memory. So both of these aspects, and let's just talk about attention, are so incredibly powerful. We know that. We know that from everything we do. We need our attention, but especially in these kind of high stakes contexts like performance, whether that's athletic performance or professional performance, regardless of the context, you need to have your attention. That is primarily what I was interested in initially, is just how do you actually understand how the brain does that? How does it create attention? And what is it that it is doing kind of more at the granular level, like literally what brain regions are doing what. And I got into neuroscience even sort of by accident. I thought I was going to be a physician. I thought I was going to be a medical doctor. But I realized that there was no way I was going to be able to spend my life in a hospital. It just was not my calling. I felt like kind of overwhelmed by the experience. And I lucked out because one of my very first volunteer opportunities, because I was on a path to become a doctor, so I thought I should volunteer, was in a brain injury unit. And I ended up working with a patient who was a long-term patient. That it's funny because it really is related to performance psychology at some level. He was, I thought, a quadriplegic. And my job was very simply just take him out for some fresh hair. And he had this very elaborate, big wheelchair. And I would have to kind of push him outdoors to give him some time. And then, like several months into this, all of a sudden he was in a different kind of wheelchair, was sitting upright, and he was moving his finger to guide the wheelchair himself, which to me was shocking because I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know he had the capability to use his body in this way. But he did. And when I talked to him a little bit about this, he said, I do all this physical therapy, and I actually at night will close my eyes and kind of imagine myself moving my finger to be able to guide my wheelchair. And that mental training has allowed me to be able to do it now. So he didn't call it mental training. He said, practicing that over and over again helps me. And that really stuck with me. And when I decided that I was going to shift toward neuroscience and not medicine, I was always really intrigued by the notion that the brain could change itself by engaging in certain kinds of practices. That was like sort of something I thought was just so cool, this notion of neuroplasticity. And at that time, I was starting to study attention. So studying attention, understanding that the brain could change itself was sort of the landscape. Once we started pursuing studies of attention in graduate school and as a postdoc, even my early years of being a professor, we learned a lot that, in fact, it is this extremely powerful system, to the point where, sometimes I'll refer to it as the brain's boss, because it really holds the reins in terms of what the rest of the brain does. It determines how we process information, what we perceive, the decisions we make, the emotions we experience, and our social interactions with other people. So it was very, very powerful. That got me kind of worried. It's like, if it is extremely powerful to the point where it's calibrating everything else going on in the brain, what happens when it fails? It's not going to be good news. So we started doing these experiments in the lab where we would perturb attention, kind of you can imagine thinking back to your undergrad days. You come in, you do some crazy things some researchers thought of, and we would do the same thing. Stress people out, present negative images, bombard them with sort of social evaluative threat where we'd say, you're at the bottom third of how anybody's ever performed in this task. And it would potently affect them. They would say, I didn't like your experiment, don't want to sign up for a second round of this, which wasn't fun, but it did tell us that these things, having threatening circumstances, stressful circumstances, negative circumstances, reliably and repeatedly would make attention fail. And then I was further troubled because I was right, that messing with attention is not a good idea. I was troubled because what are you going to do for these undergrads? It was no big deal. You come in, your attention's not so great. What about the professional circumstances and life circumstances in which you can't avoid stress, threat, negative mood? And many professionals have this, right? So some of the people that we've worked with together, military service members, also first responders, elite athletes, performance in any respect can do this. So mindfulness, to answer your question, entered my lab as a training tool, as a brain training tool, to see if we could actually help strengthen attention and protect it when the human encountered these very difficult circumstances and still had to perform. So we tried lots of things, and mindfulness ended up being one of the only things, actually the only thing, that repeatedly and reliably protected attention, which is why I've sort of pivoted to focusing on that aspect in my lab now.
Yeah, I think all of us can relate to that we really want to be paying attention, focused on whatever the task is that's in front of us, whether it's a conversation with somebody, whether we're at work or engaged in a hobby. And it just feels like our attention's always under attack. Like something's always pulling on it or, getting us off topic. And it's fascinating you said that you've studied and researched a lot of different things of how do we actually understand and train attention. And mindfulness seemed to be the only thing that was helping with that. So talk to us a little bit about what that discovery was like and how that informed things since you discovered that mindfulness was the strongest way to train our attention.
Yeah, great question. I would say the discovery process to even come to mindfulness, it wasn't a straight shot. It wasn't like, oh yeah, mindfulness, that's the obvious thing. Like I said, this is back in the early 2000s. Um, Studying the word mindfulness was not in our cultural vocabulary, right? It was, in fact, when I told my senior colleagues in my department, it was then at the University of Pennsylvania, they kind of thought I was nuts. They're like, career suicide, you're going to study this thing nobody cares about, nobody ever will. um, of course I thought it otherwise, because I understood the kinds of things that were making attention fail and the kinds of approaches that it may take to overcome that. And just to dig in on that a little bit, and you already described it. We all feel prone to distractibility, and we might say this is a modern problem because we've got cell phones and we're constantly being pulled by social media, etc. But it's actually not that modern of a problem. And one of the funny things that I actually discovered in actually writing my book was that if you look back at like medieval monks and some of the things that they said regarding their attention, they would complain that even though they were attempting to have prayerful time where they were devoted and thinking about God, all these other random thoughts would start popping into their head. These monks would be like, well, I got to think about the beer brewing I'm doing, or this other monk I'm having a problem with, or my family that I don't get to see very often anymore. So it's like they didn't have technology, they didn't have social media, and they were still struggling with the battle for their own attention. So it's definitely a human issue. It gets completely amped up when we now add all these external sources that are impinging upon us, and the notion of really social media companies running on an attention economy. We're the commodity that's for sale in those companies. So it's a very tricky situation where we truly are under threat in some sense, under attack, and our brain is being used in the service of somebody else's benefit. So how do we kind of take it back? And that kind of brings me to the question you were asking, like why out of all the things would mindfulness tend to be useful, and what was my path toward discovering that? Well, initially when we started out, we were thinking, let's just train the brain. At that point, there was a lot of brain training exercises, basically short video games you could play repeatedly to see if those would help. And, people would get better. They do get better at playing the video games the more they practice, just like any video game. If you spend a lot of time doing it, you're going to be better at the video game. The question was, what happens when you're not playing the video game? Is there generalizable benefit to your attention now when you're trying to study or have a conversation with somebody or write a report? That generalizability was basically not there. It didn't transfer over. And then I thought maybe we want to take more of a technology oriented approach. So we had like various sound and light devices where we're literally, kind of trying to stimulate the brain from external technology to see if it helped. And then in the short term, it made people a little bit more vigilant, but no long term benefits and definitely nothing protective. And I could go on and on about all the different things that we tried. But I realized that, if the challenge that people are having with their attention is tied to an internal distractibility that has to do with not knowing where your mind is in any moment, sort of landing in the middle of, oh my gosh, I haven't been doing the thing I want to do, waking up to it on the rare occasion that you're able to wake up to it. I mean, I always think of this even when I myself would be like online, all of a sudden you're already on the app, you're already scrolling, and 10 minutes in, you're like, what am I doing? I was trying to make a phone call and I'm like, I'm totally here where I should be. That waking up moment is us really being in direct contact with the contents of our mind and our attention. So I knew that probably what we needed to do is find some training tool where that would be the target so that people would become more familiar with the internal workings of their own phenomenology and then target getting better acquainted with that and better able to control where it was. And it ends up that this has been a technology that's been around for 2,500 years to actually have practices, contemplative practices that target attention in this way. And that led me to really understanding what mindfulness meditation is and then offering mindfulness based programs in a secular fashion to a whole bunch of groups, which we can talk more about.
Yeah, it's so fascinating how the simple practice of putting your attention on a specific target and trying to hold it there, that's been around, like you said, for centuries. The science is now catching up. They're like, yeah, there's some benefit to this and it actually works. And it helps in training our brain and training our attention systems to operate at a higher level. And this idea around attention and why it is so important that we want to not only be aware, but maybe have a little bit more control over it is something I think is unique and people don't maybe think about very often of like, why does it matter if my attention is where I want it to be or stays there more consistently? Is there some things that you've come to understand or know about attention and how important it really is to be able to put it where we'd like it to be or to keep it there, whether it's, performance related, relationship related, or any of those factors?
Yeah, 100%. It is. And even if you, not Brad, you meaning anybody that's
Hmm.
listening to us, think that other people should pay better attention.
Hmm.
Know that that might be true for yourself too. Like nobody likes it when you're talking to somebody and they're all over the place, right? Their eyes aren't even making contact with you. Nobody likes being in a meeting, leading a meeting, and you are like, where are these people? I'm sitting there looking at them. I just said that 5 minutes ago, and they're not getting it. There's plenty of times when we feel that other people need to do a better job with their attention, and that we could say is that means we're other people as well. We need to do a better job. And so many different contexts. The way we think about it from the brain science perspective is that attention is sort of a domain general resource, or I like to think of it really as a fuel. It's like a fuel source, right? And we could use that fuel for, powering our the lights in our house or our car or whatever. If it is domain general, what is it used for? And what we're learning is that it's used for essentially every single thing we do. The top three are our ability to think. And what I mean by that is essentially an idea comes to your mind and you have another idea that comes to mind, another idea. And how do you ensure the continuity of those ideas? You actually need attentional selection to be able to connect those. So we need it to think, we need it to feel, meaning to experience and regulate the expression of our emotions. Without attention, we wouldn't really even be aware that we're having an emotion. And we would definitely not be able to control our experience of it in any kind of real way. So thinking, feeling, and then connecting. We use our attention to work with other people, making them the objects of our attention often, or even getting a sort of a temperature read on a social climate with our awareness. So we need it for all of those dimensions. And of course, all of those feed into our performance. If we can't think, feel, and connect with an appropriateness of what the moment calls for, the chances of us acting in a way that will benefit us is very, very low. So we know this both from our own experience, but also from the brain science. And maybe it would be worth it to also talk a little bit about what attention is, because we've been kind of talking around that term.
Yeah, I love that because I think most of us realize when we are distracted how much we're not connecting with other people, not getting the work done that we might need to or like to. Or perhaps we've got something top of mind and we walk into the next room and we're like, shoot, why did I walk into this room? But there's so many examples that we tap into of when we're missing out on it or lacking it, if you will, that I think it would be really helpful to talk about. Like, what is this idea of attention? You mentioned thinking, feeling,
Yeah.
connecting with other folks. But how have you come to understand what attention really is? Because we're awake for more hours than we're asleep, and we just sort of assume we're, paying attention to things throughout
Exactly.
our day, but maybe we're not as skillful with that as we'd like to be.
Right, right. No, in fact, I'll start with that. The percentage of time that we're actually paying attention to the task that we want to pay attention to seems to be about 50%. So we are actually task focused when we want to be, when we think we want to be half of our waking moments. And that
Hmm.
really like is puzzling. It's like, what? And we've now seen this in study after study, in my lab and many, many others. We see it when we have people come in and do an intentionally demanding task. We see it when we probe them in daily life. So that's also a big puzzle. So, which we should talk about, because that means that probably we're not as attentive as we think we are.
Hmm.
But what is attention? And actually, if you think about it, all of what we are as human beings is the sort of gifts we have from our evolutionary ancestors. We are the success story of our evolution. And that might make you wonder, well, why would we have developed over the course of human evolution an attention system? And it essentially starts with this challenge that complex organisms had, which is that there's just far more information in the environment than any individual brain could fully process. So if you want to take in and understand your environment, which you need to do in order to survive, you better figure out a way in which you're going to do that. And the strategy it seems like evolution has taken is come up with a way where you can subsample what's happening in the environment, but use the full computational power of your brain to interrogate it. And so in one way we think about attention is it's or maybe even the broadest way to think about attention is it's the ability to prioritize some information over other information. When we say we're paying attention, all we're doing is saying some things are more important than other things. So then we can start thinking about what are the ways in which we prioritize, because you could have many different perspectives of how to choose to prioritize. And this maybe is a good segue into the brain, because it ends up that attention from a brain perspective is not really one thing. It falls under kind of one umbrella, but we see it as three separate things, three separate brain networks that all have this feature of allowing us to prioritize some information over other information. And the first system, and by the way, in terms of the brain, I mean, I would geek out with you on the specific brain regions, et cetera. But what I think is most important to understand is we know what these brain networks are. No complex function happens in the brain with one region doing something. But we know what these networks are. They all happen to do with the frontal lobes, which is a complex brain terrain that is the most evolutionarily involved and the latest to develop over human development. And before I get into the specifics of each network, these three networks battle each other. They fight each other. So as I describe the function of each type of attention, realize that when one type is predominant, the other ones are necessarily going to be inhibited, which might lead us to your real question, which is like, what happens and how can we use it best to our advantage? Um, the first way we prioritize some information over other information I like to use the metaphor for this. I used to use metaphors for all these things, but one way is um, something that is essentially functioning like a flashlight or a torch, depending on the part of the world that you live in. So, what is this prioritizing? Some content over other content, right? So, if we're in a darkened room and we've got a flashlight, whatever it is that we're directing that flashlight toward, we're going to get clearer, crisper information. Everything else is not prioritized. We can't see it. And it truly works like that. It's called the brain's orienting system, and it advantages and selects information so they're crisper, clearer, and everything else is sort of muted out. We don't really see it. We can understand probably pretty easily how we can use this flashlight to pay attention to the external environment. We might, sample here or there if you're walking down a darkened path at night. We also use that same system to pay attention internally. So whether it's an idea you're having and you want to really try to probe it, or a memory and you want to kind of interrogate it, we can direct the flashlight internally to get more granular details about that thing we're thinking about relative to everything else our brain could be doing at that moment. So that its features are really that it's able to be directed like an actual flashlight. It makes attention narrow, crisp, and clear, and it can be used internal or external environment. Kind of the exact opposite of that is the second system of attention, which is called the alerting system. So, unlike the flashlight, alerting I think of more as like a floodlight. It's broad, receptive. And what it advantages, what it prioritizes is this moment, the now. When we are alert, we talk about we're aware and paying attention to what's happening in this moment. You can't save up being alert for later, right? Or you can't have it be something that was in the past. So being alert really is about not disadvantaging anything. Just everything that's here could potentially be relevant. I better be aware of it because I might need to take action with any one thing. And I always think about this whenever I'm driving and I see like a construction site and there's flashing lights. I'm like, ooh, pay attention in that alert, vigilant manner. So we've got paying attention to content, which is the flashlight, the moment, which is the floodlight. And then the third system of attention is prioritizing based on our goals. And basically meaning anything that is goal relevant becomes the most important way it's going to select for what it does. And this system is something called executive functioning. And we use that term sort of executive because it is like the executive of an organization. The executive's job is to make sure the goals of what you should be doing, considering, and your actions are aligned. And when they're not aligned, the executive is supposed to course correct, change the goal, revise the goal, or fix the action so you're not doing the wrong thing and you're doing the right thing. And the metaphor I like to use here is it's sort of like a juggler. We're kind of keeping all those balls in the air, coordinating them, overseeing and monitoring what's going on. So now when you think about these three systems, like I was saying at the outset, if one is active, the other ones are going to be kind of deactivated in some sense. So think about the last time you were sort of reading a book or doing something where you took all your energy and you were focused on some content. Somebody walks in the room and starts talking to you. Probably it's going to take you a beat before you're going to be like, what? What did you say? So what happened in that moment? That flashlight was very keenly pointed toward whatever it is that you're doing. And the floodlight is sort of dialed down. You've already plugged into a goal. So even executive functioning is dialed down. And it takes a moment for those things to kind of get online. And that's why you weren't even aware of what was happening in the environment around you. And maybe you're not even aware that you were having this goal of reading because you were already so immersed in already reading.
Mm. Yeah, it was really fascinating about that concept of understanding the different functions of attention, how it works. Is we start to see how the decisions we make on a moment to moment basis can be impacted by our decision. One of the things we're really passionate about is this idea of quality of life, and we have a sense of some of those goals of like, I probably would like to move a little bit more, or eat a certain way, or recover, and yet we find ourselves over and over again maybe not making the decisions or engaging in the behaviors that get us there. And sometimes we don't even realize we even have the choice or have the opportunity to make those decisions, like the juggler, because things are happening in our life. Are there things that you've come to see and understand that inhibit or maybe throw us for a loop when it comes to, well, if I know what my goal is, why is it not easier to make decisions and pay attention to those decisions that align with that goal? Like, what gets in the way of being able to make those decisions in line with our goals.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is the big puzzle of like, even when we know what we want to do, why aren't we doing it? Right.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think attention has a lot to do with it. It actually is sort of what I would call like the dark matter of attention, the thing that we don't see
Mm.
that has such a strong influence on us, which remember we were talking a while ago about that 50% number. So if 50% of our waking moment, we're actually doing the thing we want to do, what the heck's going on in the other 50%?
Mm-hmm.
My hunch, and based on the research, is that a lot of what derails us is tied to that other 50%. So, really, what we're talking about there is not having an awareness of what we are experiencing and what we are even doing moment to moment. I mean, all of us have had that experience of driving somewhere and you're like, how did I even get here? I have no idea. Right. Thankfully, everything was safe. But could you remember any specific detail about the entire journey? No. And that's in some sense great because that means that we can function, when there's, even when there's complexity, we can function. But it's not great in terms of understanding when that happens in other contexts. So, for example, we can have a goal in mind and very soon forget that we have a goal in mind of what we're trying to conduct. And we talked about that a little bit when it comes to like social media. It's like I have a goal, I forgot it, and now I'm off doing
Mm-hmm.
something else. The other thing is sort of the susceptibility of the way our attention works and what is it prioritized by default. There's a couple of things that'll do prioritize by default. So let's go back to that example of like walking walking down a darkened path and you've got a flashlight, right? Um, you got an agenda. You're trying to get to wherever you're going. It's dark. You're going to look at the ground, point it. Now, let's say all of a sudden you hear a weird sound or some rustling of some sort. You're going to take that flashlight. You're going to point it to wherever it is that you thought you heard it from. In some sense, your attention was captured by something that was either novel, threatening, potentially of interest. That is the thing about this flashlight. It can be directed, but can also be yanked. And it can be yanked by things that have these same qualities of, because they advantaged our survival. It made sense to pay attention by default, overriding whatever you had going on else in your mind to something that could be potentially threatening. Now we're at the point where brains are very sophisticated and the threat does not even need to be external. I could just have the thought, like even the thought of, did I turn off my stove? Did I lock my door? There are certain potent, just internally alarming or alerting things that can throw off your attention, let alone in the context of performance. Like, oh, was that the right thing I was supposed to do? Or or somehow, you made an error in something you were trying to do and you can't kind of let go of it. Our attention would get yanked by it. So a lot of things have to do, a lot of reasons that we don't achieve our goals in the way we want are tied to sort of these by default things the brain does, including forgetting what the goal is altogether. And then there's other things that we do by habit that are really not good for us, like multitasking. But we can talk
Mm-hmm.
about that more.
Yeah. And I like that you mentioned that of, we can have this idea of, hey, here's what I'm setting out to do or what I'd like to accomplish, some of the tasks or behaviors that are going to help me move closer to the person I'd like to be or the goals I've set. And, moment to moment throughout the day, it's almost like we completely forget or we're not even aware of the decisions we make or how we're being impacted by the environments around us, which does lead me to what we're starting to find as a way to potentially help us to combat that, which is mindfulness. And mindfulness has sort of had a glow up over the last couple years here,
Yeah.
where it's hard to look anywhere and not find it in podcasts and magazines and apps and et cetera, and see, a variety of folks engage with it. How have you come to understand, or how would you define or describe what mindfulness is to someone who might be asking you, hey, what is mindfulness all about?
Yeah. And it is sort of an interesting cultural moment because it's around a lot. You hear it a lot, but I don't know if most people even know what we're talking about when we even use that term. So let's connect the dots to what you just said. You said, one of the challenge points, as I was talking about a few moments ago, is our lack of awareness of what's happening around us. We have no idea in this moment what we're attempting to do, and even sometimes what we are doing. So the way I think about this is, if we think about the mind, and I like to use it, I mean, I kind of use metaphors all the time when I think about these complex brain processes. If we think about the mind, sort of like an MP3 player, like even like looking on the screen right now, you've got a fast forward, rewind, play. Much of what the mind does very, very well and in a useful manner is it can transport itself in time, something we call mental time travel. So if the mind is like an MP3 player, we can fast forward the mind to the future to plan ahead. We can rewind the mind to the past. And these are important things that the brain can do. If we're in the middle of doing something and we have a goal of what we need to be doing, but all of a sudden we're rewinding or fast forwarding, we're not accomplishing what we set out to do in this moment. And the challenge is half the time in our waking moments, we are not doing what we said we're going to do. So there is this real vulnerability. The further problem is that sometimes when you rewind the mind and you're in a very demanding present moment situation, you may actually be less prone to being present. You may be more prone to rewinding the mind and getting stuck there because you're ruminating about the last time you were in this situation, or you're thinking about the future and saying, "Oh, I'm so scared I'm not going to accomplish this goal." So you're making up realities or reflecting on past that are not this moment. So I always like to say, in terms of your question about what mindfulness is, uh, mindfulness is the opposite of that type of wandering mind. It is essentially keeping that button on play so that we are experiencing the moment to moment unfolding of our lives in a very direct way. And kind of the formal definition I would give is it's mindfulness as paying attention to our present moment experience without elaboration, without thinking about what's happening in this moment, and without emotional reactivity. Being in the here and the now without a story about it. And of course we want that. We want to be able to fast forward and rewind when it's useful, but we want to be able to be present when that's the useful thing to do. And we don't want to be bothered by sort of editorializing about what this present moment is. It doesn't matter. We're trying to be in the moment right now. So because there's so much pressure by the default way the brain functions to be somewhere else, simply saying, be mindful is not sufficient. We've got to train for it. We've got to actually put effort into getting ourselves to practice being in the moment more frequently and consistently so that as we move through our lives, we can benefit from the fact that we can show up more. And I like the analogy of physical fitness. Like, I think about this every time I travel and I'm trying to put a heavy carry-on, piece of luggage above above my seat. If I'm not strong enough to lift that up in that moment, it's not the right time to jump on the ground and start doing some push-ups. Like, I have to embody the thing that I know I will need. And what we know we'll need as human beings is the clear ability to pay attention, to be able to notice what's going on and get the raw data of our lives. Or else all of these things that we plan to do, intend to do, have done in the past mean nothing. So I see mindfulness as a very powerful tool to train the mindfulness training is a powerful way to train the brain to be present centered to serve us in our lives.
I love the analogy there of thinking of it as exercise, because I think a lot of us can relate to that a little bit more easily of, okay, if there's maybe a certain aesthetic I'd like to achieve or a performance I'd like to be able to accomplish, or, certain biomarkers with my heart rate and my blood pressure, I want those to be a certain way. Well, I know that there's probably some behaviors or exercises I can do to help me work towards that. Much the same way of mindfulness. If I would like to be more connected in the moments I'm in with my loved ones, at work, enjoying the scenery when I'm taking that vacation, well, there's probably some exercises that give me a better chance of experiencing that or being more present. And mindfulness isn't about being or engaging in the practice 24 hours a day. It's, hey, there's specific time and place where I'm going to engage in these mental exercises, and then I will most likely achieve some of these outcomes or benefits. And you mentioned, research being a major factor here to influence what we're coming to know and understand. So I'd love for you to share, what are some of the highlights that you've seen, or maybe even some of the surprises around how engaging in mental exercise, such as mindfulness, have delivered some results that maybe others might be interested in or looking for?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when we think about like the quantified human, somebody who wants to see results, I think that's really, I'm orient that way. I'm a scientist, right? So I like the idea of like, I need to see tangibly, concretely that there's something beneficial happening. Mindfulness, and even though I described it as clearly as I possibly could as a neuroscientist who studies attention, may seem a little fuzzy or like soft. How you can actually figure this out? Well, what we know is that in the brain, in the same way we would exercise to want to see physical results, right? Either it's the structure, the function of our physical beings. When we look within the brain, we can actually see structural and functional differences with people engaging in mindfulness meditation. And that to me is very, very compelling because I can say I feel better after I practice. My performance may even be better. But when I can see that doing this is changing the way my brain is functioning, that's pretty cool. So there's two main kinds of results that we're seeing with mindfulness training. So these are programs in which, well, there are two different kind of contexts. One is where people just chose to practice mindfulness. These could be Tibetan monks that chose to do it and they're doing it sort of as part of their cultural and spiritual practice, or people that go to the local pain clinic, learn about mindfulness based stress reduction, and start practicing it because they want to see if they can help them change their relationship to pain and not suffer so much. Or it could be depression, or it could be substance use. There's so many clinical applications for mindfulness. So regardless of the context, what we see is that the brain is impacted, and the most reliable impact that we see is in terms of its functioning. So the two things that we see in the brain are that the brain network, something called the default mode network, which is essentially where the mind goes when it's wandering around and we're not task focused. So we call it, and it's kind of funny to call it default. It's almost our default. We're self-related, we're internal, we're thinking about things. That thing you're doing when you don't notice what's happening and how you got to your drive, 20 minutes later, is your default mode in action. That activity tends to be dialed down in people that are practicing mindfulness. So functionally speaking, it is less active. And also the networks of attention, in particular, these executive networks, look like their integrity is stronger. It's almost like their structural ability to do the job of what is needed is better. And then the relationship between the default mode and attention network seems to be much more fluid and good in communication. So, and in addition to that, with the long-term practitioners like these monastics that might be doing it, going on a 3-year retreat, you can see actual structural changes in their brain that suggest that that function is transforming into real brain structures looking healthier. So those things I think are really, really exciting from the brain science point of view. In the work that you and I've actually been able to do together, my goals are much more practical regarding helping people work better in their work life. And so, you and I met because of a project that we were doing with the US military. And part of this collaboration with the Army, which has been now for about 15 years, started because no matter what, they were going to be in the toughest situations. Like it could be even through training or, of course, through deployment itself. They were going to meet these, what I sometimes call kryptonite for the brain and particularly attention, threatening, stressful, negative circumstances. And they still need to be able to do the job that they need to do. So a lot of the work we have been doing in that context is figuring out how you can deliver mindfulness training in a way that is accessible, and what is the minimum effective dose that you could actually train people up in so that they can do it, reasonably do it. Most of us cannot go on a, 3-year retreat to go in the mountaintops and just meditate all day. Nor might we want to, but we can't probably even do a week-long retreat, right? So the chances of doing the kind of classical tradition-based approaches isn't going to work. And then even within the clinical context, the best training program, the gold standard of mindfulness, is an 8-week program called mindfulness-based stress reduction. Very, very excellent program. One of our dear mentors is the developer of that program, John Kabat-Zinn. But that program also requires about 45 minutes a day of daily practice. So some of the research has been asking, well, what is the minimum effective dose? It looks like it's about 12 to 15 minutes a day, 3 to 4 times a week of formal mindfulness practice. And then also, how can you scale this up? How can you design a program so that it doesn't have to be me as the program developer or researcher delivering it, but I can actually train other people who may or may not know anything about mindfulness to deliver it. So one of the first studies that you were a really key collaborator was that you became one of our trainers, right, as a performance psychology expert. And that was very gratifying because what we found was that not only could you and your colleagues that already have this performance psychology background be trained up to deliver it effectively so that soldiers were benefiting, but training you to do it as somebody who was familiar with the challenges soldiers have, and why performance is so important, was better than having somebody who was a mindfulness based stress reduction expert who had been practicing and delivering these longer form programs for 25 years, knew nothing about what it meant to be a soldier receiving this training. So it was both that we could go shorter, we could train up trainers, and then those trainers being very, very well aware of the context of what the professionals that we were dealing with were offering. Um, them delivering it was most effective.
Yeah, it's amazing how the benefits that we're starting to see through research really can tie to any number of goals or aspirations that people might have. If they're saying, I want to live a long, healthy life and try and stay and keep as much vitality as I possibly can, we know that the brain structures are changing in such a way that will support that you can live a longer, healthier life, and through mindfulness practice, be able to enjoy those extra years. And then we also know for those that are like, you know what, I really want some of those performance benefits. I want to be able to stay engaged with whatever the task is, with whatever the job is, regardless of the environment, stress or no stress. How do I do that? We know it can also deliver those benefits as well. And so, regardless of why you might find your way into mindfulness as a way to combat maybe some stress you might be experiencing, performance benefits, or just want to stay sharp mentally, it can really apply to any of those areas. And you mentioned the minimum effective dose, which I think is a really powerful point for folks. Is we hear all these folks, oh, you got to wake up and have a gratitude practice and then journal for 20 minutes, then meditate for 20 minutes. And they're like, I don't have enough time in the day to do all these things that I'm being tasked or would like to do. So that
Yeah.
makes it a little bit more manageable. If you can find 10 to 12, 15 minutes a couple times a week, you will most likely experience some of those benefits. Are there other sort of benefits that you've seen? Because I think folks start to read up on some of the ways in which mindfulness is impacting and helping people. We know it
Yeah.
helps with brain structures. We know it helps with some of the performance things. Are there other, whether it's anecdotal or subjective things
Yeah,
you've
no, there are
come across?
definitely other. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So when we talked about, sort of thinking, feeling, connecting is the power of
Mm,
attention. It ends up that a mindfulness training touches all of those. Like with the thinking, we already talked about sort of attentionally demanding decision making kind of tasks. People report, and even objective metrics suggest there's improvements with that. With when we talk about our emotions, mindfulness training has a very powerful effect on reducing symptoms tied to depression, anxiety, panic disorder. I mean, the array of psychological disorders that it benefits is quite a lot, but also mood. And those that don't have any clinical disorders, we tend to have more positive mood, less negative mood, less perceived stress, etc. So the thinking and feeling beneficial effects are there. You already described the beneficial effects with performance, and that's not just uh, performance in terms of self-report, but even things like marksmanship. When we talk about soldiers, that they're not only meeting the mark when they should, but they're not shooting when they should not. And I think both of those are really, really important, especially because you don't want anybody doing anything they shouldn't be doing. But sorry, thinking, feeling, and then social functioning. Very, very interesting benefits for team cohesion, for example. So, since the early days, Brad, when we worked together and, you were one of our trainers, we went on to do a larger study with basic combat training, 1,500 soldiers in training. And those studies are just starting to come out that in addition to all the psychological health benefits and self reported presence in their lives, even things like visits for medical encounters, injuries they get are reduced, and their report of pain is reduced. So it's like their whole being is sort of being benefited by this, so that illness is coming on less strongly, injuries coming on less strongly. They're protected from that by engaging in mindfulness practice, in addition to the body and mind benefits. But there's one other thing I wanted to tell you, kind of tied to the thing you said about longevity, that I think is fascinating. And it's just one thing to keep in mind. It's not an area that I study, but I think it excites me of why I would practice every day, or why I practice every day. And that has to do with the research on mindfulness training and telomeres. So I don't know if you've ever talked about telomeres on this
mm-mm.
podcast, but Telomeres are the end caps of our chromosomes, sort of like the end of a shoelace, like that little part that's sort of, no, actually, better analogy. It's like the end of a zipper. And actually, it functions like that. The telomere length is like the zipper kind of trying to catch on for cell replication. And the shorter the telomere, the shorter the life of the cell. So the length of your telomere is basically an indication of your longevity. And telomeres can actually be, it's sad. It's like, okay, well, I've got short telomeres, I'm out of luck. But you can actually repair telomeres with an enzyme called telomerase. So there's a built-in mechanism for us to improve our longevity by correcting a lot of the shortening that could happen. Stress, terrible way to, it's a great surefire way to shorten your telomeres. So anyway, mindfulness training and other forms of contemplative training have found to increase the amount of telomerase as well as telomere length, which
Hmm.
is to me pretty exciting. It's like you're having an impact. Your mind and your body and the way that you're functioning when you practice formally is literally changing the longevity of your cells.
That's some pretty fascinating research to hear that not only are we impacting ourselves maybe in the short term, but also in the long term and setting ourselves up for success. Because I think when you start looking at the benefits we experience from how we think, how we feel, and how we interact with others, it makes a lot of sense why folks are turning toward mindfulness and noticing, hey, there's some changes here. I'm starting to become more aware of how I think and how I feel, how I interact with others, being a little bit more intentional, showing up the way I'd like to, rather than being along for this roller coaster ride. And it helps people feel like, hey, there's some sense of control that
Yeah.
I have, because there's so much going on around us that we don't have control over, but we will have some influence over how I think about situations, how emotionally I can regulate, and eventually how do I connect with others. So those performance benefits, as well as the extending of life, really, really cool. And so I think people might be asking themselves then, okay, well, I understand attention. I understand a little bit more about mindfulness and some of the benefits. What does this actually look like? How do I engage in the practice? How do I engage in this mental exercise? Are there places you have found that have been most helpful or beneficial for people to start? Whether there's somebody who's maybe brand new on the journey, hasn't engaged in a formal mindfulness meditation practice, or maybe folks who are been doing it on and off, kind of interested. How do I get consistent with it? What are some of the things that either you've seen or interacted with that help people in that regard?
Yeah, well, the really good news for people that are listening to your podcast is that you are a fabulous resource. So if you get people wanting to learn how to practice, you can guide them. I mean, you have all the tools and have been a wonderful teacher and trainer in all these projects that we've done together. Another place they can look, because I've sort of spelled out almost like the mental workout of mindfulness in my book. That's another resource. But maybe even right now, we could talk about like a very foundational practice that people can do just starting right now. And even if you want to aspire to doing 12 to 15 minutes a day, start out with a minute to 30 seconds if you've never done it before. And, you'll hear as I describe the practice how it really aligns with those three systems of attention in terms of what you do and what you might be strengthening, which was why it was such a great fit for the work that we were doing and my interest as an attention researcher. This practice is oftentimes, a lot of our military colleagues will call it push-ups for the mind, because it is sort of like a mental workout or that you can do. But essentially, the instruction for a very simple practice, it's like three steps. Pick a period of time during the day, and like I said, start out small with even like a minute. We could work up to 5 minutes in your first week if you'd like. And the intention here is that you're going to use this time to train your attention. And to launch that process, you're going to pick a target object that will be the focus of your attention. A really handy one that we always have with us, no matter where we are, no extra props needed, is our breath. And it ends up being very helpful because not only do we have it with us, but it's not such an enticing, interesting uh, target that we're just going to be thrown, and it's not like the most exciting movie you've ever seen, paying attention to your breath. But importantly, you're not trying to control your breath here. You're just using it as an anchor. So it's going to happen as it naturally does. And for the period of time you're going to formally practice, that will be the anchoring object. And the first part of the instruction, once you kind of settle yourself in, notice that there is breathing happening, is to take that flashlight of attention and have your intention be to keep it on breath related sensations, just your own experience of your body breathing. So that's the engagement of that first system of attention. Pay attention to the breath and have the goal be, I'm going to stay on the breath. The second step is essentially noticing. And what you're noticing is if you're on the goal or not. Is my attention on the breath or has it gone somewhere else? So where's the flashlight in this moment? And that's really what I call this practice, the find your flashlight practice. So you're focusing on the breath, you're noticing, and let's say in one moment you notice, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about lunch or dinner or whatever you might be thinking about, a million things. In that moment, it's your opportunity moment because you noticed where your attention was. And wherever that flashlight is, just bring it back. So, these three simple steps are essentially focus, notice, and redirect. And if you repeat this for the minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes that you do, it really does seem to tap into strengthening all three of those systems of attention. And then you can see for yourself how it makes you feel throughout the rest of your day.
Yeah, I love the simplicity of that practice. Just picking a target, picking a time, and then just coming back to that target over and over again. Like you mentioned, non-judgmentally. You'll probably notice that there will be some mind wandering, might get distracted, and that's okay. It's just that opportunity to strengthen and get in some of those mental reps. And I love that we've taken this journey of understanding the brain and the attention systems, understanding what mindfulness is, and even starting to figure out how do we engage with practices. One of the things I mentioned that we're really passionate about is how do we help improve the quality of life of other folks, and we do that through a variety of means, whether it's the way we move or eat, the way we recover, the way we engage and train with mental exercises. But I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, how have you come to either understand or how do you think about this concept of quality of life? And what does that mean to you? Because I'm always fascinated to hear how different practitioners have come to think of this concept and what it means to them.
Yeah, no, I think it's a profound question and a great one to always be asking yourself. So, quality of life to me is not some idea of being on a beautiful beach with my feet up and everything is calm and cool. It really is more about being able to be in the hustle of life with all full access to all of who I am, with my full capacity. And in fact, that's sort of what I love about even the book title. I didn't get a full choice of what it was, but I love the term peak mind because it's not about achieving some special state. It's about having all of me to be able to do what I need to do. And so part of the search for quality of life is to check in with all of those forces or behaviors or attitudes that are precluding you from having that full access and to support and lean in to practices that give you all of you back, so that you have all the resources that are already within you to tackle all the fun and challenge that life brings.
I love that perspective, and that definitely resonates with me. This idea of being in the middle of it, being in the hustle, and having access to all of you to really see what you're capable of, what your potential is, and how you can interact in any moment. So I think that's a really cool way to think about quality of life, and I can see how our attention and training ourselves in such a way that we can be fully present, fully engaged with each moment allows us and allows you to truly experience a higher quality of life. And so, with that, I do want to spend a minute or two just asking about the book because I've been fortunate enough to read it, Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Mind. And it is an awesome book. It lays out some of the conversations we've had here today, but also gives some really awesome examples and ways people can train themselves with mindfulness. So, I want to speak a moment or two just about the book, what that process was like creating the book, and then what it's been like since it's been released now.
Yeah, no, it's been a terrific journey with the book. And really, the motivation was we've been doing all this research in my lab with wonderful collaborators and partners over all these years. And I felt like we knew enough. We know enough now where I felt like more people should benefit from the knowledge we have. And I happen to really enjoy being able to provide that in a way that I feel can be as accessible as possible because oftentimes people can be intimidated like, what, mindfulness, neuroscience? I don't want to deal with any of that. But these are ordinary human capabilities, and if we explain them and welcome people in an easy way, I think people want to give it a shot. So uh, Writing the book took everything I had. It really was the full hustle of it. And if I didn't have a practice, I don't know how I could do it. I actually wrote it during the pandemic, so that was its own a special journey. The other thing was really interesting opportunity in the book was being able to finally share the stories of so many extraordinary people that I've been able to meet through this, whether it's military leaders or political leaders, athletes, so many wonderful now colleagues and friends that are showing us over and over again what it means to actually have a peak mind in the service of a peak life in some sense, regardless of how unusual that life may be. And it's been fun because I think it's now translated into 15 languages. So having a reach that is more than I ever could have imagined has been a lot of fun. And the fact that it became a national bestseller was a real bonus. That
Yeah.
was really nice. So I appreciate you mentioning the book.
Yeah, there's some amazing resources out there for mindfulness. I can't recommend Peak Mind enough for somebody who's maybe interested to learn a little bit more about why folks are engaging in the practice, what sort of benefits it might derive, and giving you a blueprint for how to execute that. And so for Amishi, for those folks out there who maybe want to either get connected or learn a little bit more about what you're up to in your lab, what are some of the ways that people could either stay in touch or get connected with what you've got going on in your neck of the woods?
Yeah. So if you can remember the 6 letters of my first name, AMISHI.com, you can find all the stuff we're up to in my lab and in my work. And then I'm also available through social media. So, all the regular channels.
Yeah. Well, I know I'm very fortunate and grateful that our paths have crossed. We've had the chance to collaborate and work together over the years and look forward to upcoming, research projects and ways we can help spread the word of mindfulness and help others to experience some of those benefits and develop a practice that can be meaningful and impact their life. And so with that, thanks so much for spending some time chatting with me on the podcast for today. Look forward to the next opportunity we get to connect.
Same here. Thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun.